B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, April 26, 2017. And we continue to watch the creeping police state activities here in the United States of America. I got a fresh dispatch from ace reporter Bo Hodai. He's based in Arizona, and in an article published today, actually yesterday, at the Progressive magazine, Bo Hodai reveals that in Arizona, when the FBI frames somebody and then decides, well, you know, this isn't really worth prosecuting, that the state of Arizona steps in with its own looser standards of a terrorism law and proceeds to prosecute and convict. And I'm going to share with you just one of the 4 episodes that are depicted or described in this new investigative journalism report. And it relates to a young man who has been sentenced to 8 years in state prison. His name is Mahin Khan. He's from Tucson. He was groomed by FBI informants over a 4-year period, starting when he was 14. Mahin Khan is described as a child with serious learning disabilities, so extreme that he could not attend school. And yet he was the subject of a 4-year effort to monitor and provoke him into committing some sort of crime. And Bo Hodai details it in this story, how his mom noticed these phone calls coming in, so she took away her son's cell phone. The calls started coming on the family's home phone, a landline. And she made sure that whenever she was there, she answered the phone first. And not one, but 2 different FBI informants were trying to recruit and manipulate her retarded son. And according to the court documents, FBI agents told her that her son needed to undergo a mental health evaluation. The family consented. They took the young man to a private mental health facility in Tucson where he was held for 45 days. And after his release, Mom said FBI agents would visit the house every month or 2. And first there was a handler named Nathan who attended their mosque, who presented himself as an Afghan bodybuilder. And Nathan tried to persuade the young man when he was only 14 to move in with him. I mean, this is so bizarre. Then another operative whose name was Omar started calling the house. And Mom grew suspicious, and she said, "Why you call my son? Stop calling my son. Next time if you call my son, I'm telling the FBI your number, your name, and everything." And she later told Bo Hodai, "And I'm stupid because I don't know that's FBI person. I'm talking to FBI person." And at one point, because his mom wouldn't allow Mahin to have a phone, 2 undercover FBI employees spent approximately a month and a half trying to smuggle a phone to the boy, and then when Mom took a vacation, they successfully handed it off to him. And just 2 weeks after his 18th birthday, the FBI arrested him. The offense was terrorism, for an act of terrorism by seeking assistance in obtaining weapons, and a recipe for an improvised explosive device. And what you learn from this is that these were conversations he had with his FBI handlers. Now, after all this 4-year period, the FBI is, in my terms, grooming this young retarded boy. And at the end of it all, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the feds, declined to prosecute. And so the Office of the Arizona Attorney General decided to take up the case. Arizona state law doesn't require the commission of an overt act to prosecute terrorism conspiracies. Although the law does require that any defined act of terrorism had to be aimed at Arizona state agencies or state buildings. But the complaints stated that he had been targeting an Air Force recruitment center. That's federal property. So then they issued an indictment and just claimed that he was trying to blow up the DMV in a Phoenix suburb. Now, that is just one case. And this young, retarded boy who was framed by the FBI, the feds said the case was too weak to prosecute, or insignificant, I guess. And so the state of Arizona steps in, convicts this kid, and he is now serving an 8-year stretch in state prison. This is outrageous. And I believe that it happens far too often. Last week I shared with you the important series published by Trevor Aronson at The Intercept. And tomorrow I'm scheduled to record an in-depth interview with Aronson, and we will detail some of his findings about how people who were charged with terrorism crimes then flipped and became government informants in order to turn and deliver for prosecution the next round of framed-up schlubs. And I believe in our Constitution. I believe we can be a nation of laws. I believe our criminal justice system works, more or less, much of the time. There are many inconsistencies, and there are unjust convictions. There's no question in my mind. But, 80-90% of what goes on in the criminal justice system is relatively justified. But when you see these kinds of extreme violations of constitutional rights and legal precedents, and they're tolerated by prosecutors, by government officials, by judges, we have become a police state where you cannot challenge the authority of the FBI, and you see that a state-level prosecution can be substituted when the feds say, that's not worth it. Another important story today is an open letter published at The Nation magazine by Richard Falk. He is a distinguished professor. He served as a UN monitor for years of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He's been a guest on this program, and I conducted a public interview with him a few years ago. I am deeply impressed by Richard Falk. And as a professor and an academic, he co-authored with Virginia Tilley a lengthy open letter to UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. And he took her to task because recently the two authors of this, Falk and Tilley, were part of a team instructed by the United Nations to prepare a study and a report on, and they did publish a report. It's called Israeli Practices Toward the Palestinian People and the Question of Apartheid. Now, I know apartheid is a highly charged word, but apparently Nikki Haley never got past the title because she just smeared and slammed the very existence of this report, threatened to sanction the United Nations and try to redirect its orientation, claimed that it was anti-Israel, and based on the letter that I have in my hand here, it appears that the authors don't believe that Nikki Haley actually read their report, and they're probably right. They say, so far we have not received any information identifying the flaws you have found in the report or how it may have failed to comply with scholarly standards of rigor. Instead, you have felt free to castigate the UN for commissioning the report and us for authoring it. You have launched defamatory attacks on all involved, designed to discredit and malign the messengers rather than clarify your criticisms of the message. Ad hominem attacks are usually the tactics of those so seized with political fervor as to abhor rational discussion. We were especially troubled by the extraordinary pressure your office exerted on the UN Secretary-General, apparently inducing him first to order the report's removal from a website, then to accept the resignation of the group's distinguished and highly respected Executive Secretary, Rima Khalaf. And instead of using a global forum to call for the critical debate about the report, you used your weight, the weight of your office, to quash it. And it may have been the word apartheid alone was enough to trigger your response, a reaction undoubtedly abetted by Israel's instantaneous denunciation of our report. In following Israel's public lead, however, you fail to consider that Israeli leaders have themselves grasped and warned of the apartheid features of their policies for decades. And then they list comments using the term apartheid used by Israeli officials over a 10 or 15-year period. So I encourage you to read this open letter. And if you're inclined to support Nikki Haley and Benjamin Netanyahu, I invite you to pry open your mind far enough to expose yourself to the analysis of Richard Falk and his team. I think this is highly significant. And rather refuse to discuss the issues that are obviously contentious to Israelis and Zionists in this report. Dialogue, debate, that is what is called for. But the Israelis always want to squelch debate. And here's the latest example. Yesterday, Benjamin Netanyahu canceled a meeting with the visiting German foreign minister because the foreign minister plans to sit down with Israeli rights groups, including the Breaking the Silence group, a whistleblower critical of Israeli military actions in the West Bank. They want to stifle and scuttle any effort to discuss these issues. That's their approach on boycott, divestment, and sanction, too. They won't sit down with the boycotters and the sanctioners and the divestors and say, hey, can we work this out? Because they know they're wrong. And they are defending an immoral position, and the only way you can do that is by refusing to talk about it. Meanwhile, there is a new report from French intelligence which supports the contention of the Trump White House that the Syrian government was responsible for the April 4th chemical incident in the town of Khan Shaykhur, Syria. And they base it on analysis that they say that the sarin that was used in that attack had the signature, the chemical signature, of previous chemical incidents attributed to the Syrian government. So in addition to proving the presence of sarin in environmental samples collected from the impact zone, the French analysis indicated the sarin was delivered using aerial munitions, which rules out the theory that the chemical attack was perpetrated by rebel forces who don't possess an air force. The report says, we know from a certain source that the process of fabrication of the samples taken is typical of the method developed in Syrian laboratories. This method is the signature of the regime, and it is what enables us to establish the responsibility of the attack. We know because we kept samples from previous attacks that we were able to use for comparison. Now, one of those previous attacks is the disputed one in the suburb of Damascus, August of 2013. Ghouta is the name of the area. And that is, widely believed to have been the responsibility of the Syrian government, but independent investigations show that that's probably not true. So we are building the evidence for the April 4th incident on questionable analysis and conclusions drawn from previous incidents. And there may be evidence that Syria was directly responsible for this. I do not rule that out, but I remain skeptical because all we're seeing are these kinds of weasel word phrases it's consistent with, it's their signature. But we don't have evidence that the plane that took off from the air base that made the assault on Khan Shaykhur at 7 a.m. actually had a chemical weapon. And in the French report, let me see if I can find it here in my highlighted copy. I'm reading from the Washington Post now. In the hours of after the April 4 attack, the Syrian government claimed the sarin emanated from a rebel-run chemical factory after it was bombed by Syrian planes. There is little known evidence to support that claim, writes the Post. On the morning of the attack, a network of civilian observers warned as Syrian warplanes took off from the nearby Sheret airfield and headed for Khan Shaykhur. As the aircraft circled in the sky, an observer radioed out to warn of an imminent attack. Guys, tell people to wear masks. It has chemicals with it, I am sure of that. Now, these are unnamed civilian observers. And I can't prove who they are, but my first suspicion is that they're the white helmets. And so this is another report that portends to establish, beyond some doubt, that Syria was responsible. But it's based on unnamed sources, evidence that hasn't been shown to the public. And that is the pattern that I see pretty consistently. In the same conflict, Turkey, which is claiming to be an ally of the United States and trying to vanquish the Islamic State from Syrian territory, well, they went rogue once again, and they struck American-backed Kurdish troops in Iraq and Syria yesterday, killing at least 18. Now, they're supposed to be our ally, but they are using the fog of this war to try to wipe out the Kurdish fighters who are the most effective allies of the United States against the Islamic State. And it just shows that the double cross continues. Obama brought the Erdogan government into the so-called alliance in Syria, and he was never able to really manage the Turkish operation there. And Trump is even in worse shape because he's so conflicted with his business investments in Turkey and his deep relationships with allies of Erdogan. And that's why he remains silent about the massive sweeps of individuals in Turkey following the failed alleged coup last July 15th. And just yesterday, another 1,000, this time Turkish police officers accused of being allies of Fethullah Gulen, who's still in exile in Pennsylvania. We have not extradited him to Turkey despite their demands. Over 1,000, the actual number is 1,009, police officers were arrested yesterday. This joins 45,000 people who are already in custody and over 100,000 people who lost their jobs, including some judges. Now, keep that in mind as we look at this next report from the New York Times about the judges who oversaw Turkey's referendum a week ago Sunday. Well, it turns out that as a result of the purges after the alleged coup or coup attempt last summer, that what used to be the highly respected court that oversaw elections, and it's got a name that uses the letters YSK. Well, many members of the YSK were purged, others resigned, and so the panel of people on the YSK that oversaw this election were all newly appointed by Erdogan. And when one of their members demanded that they change the rules during the middle of Election Day, at 4 p.m., they changed the rules nationwide to allow ballots that didn't have official stamps on them, as required by law, to be eligible for counting. It's expected that those numbered in the millions. And the margin was just a couple of percentage points, so it could have proved critical to the outcome. So 8 new members were appointed just in the weeks after the coup. The fact that 8 of the 11 judges were appointed during a crackdown on the judiciary and amid such an environment of fear raises questions about their neutrality. That's a comment from Kore Kaliskan, a politics professor in Istanbul. So when you see this, it was rigged. It was rigged, pure and simple. And Trump called to congratulate Erdogan on his great victory in the referendum that essentially makes him dictator for life. Every day I like to pause for a second and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Great folks like Paul Tomaselli, Cynthia Von Hendricks, Abby McMillan, Natalie Reel. I'm really grateful for your support, and I invite others to join in. Come on over to peterbcollins.com click on the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. It takes you to the sign-up page. You've got options there that can be tailored to your budget. And if you take out a new annual $50 subscription and give me a mailing address in the continental U.S., I've got a bonus book to send out to you. I'm releasing my latest in-depth interview today featuring my friend Norman Solomon. I've known him for 25 years. He is a very committed and effective progressive activist, both on the local level here in Northern California and nationally. He was one of the wranglers of the Bernie delegate coalition last summer, trying to move the Democratic Party in the right direction at its convention. And I was hoping today that I could link this comment that I'm going to insert here from the interview with Norman Solomon with a report on the bizarre White House briefing of every member of the United States Senate about the status of tensions with North Korea. And I believe the meeting is underway right now, but I haven't seen a word in online media at the Times or the Washington Post. But this comment that you're going to hear from Norman Solomon is what I expect we are going to hear from both Democrats and Republicans when they emerge from this super-secret briefing about the threat of North Korea at the White House today.
Well, it's very much a bipartisan enterprise. The warfare state is sustained not only by the mass media and the figures within it, with very few exceptions, but also both parties are often trying to outdo themselves in terms of how tough they are, how much they get behind the military and so forth. And the pernicious and dangerous effects are just massive. You know, where do you begin? There's so many cities you can go through in this country, and you wonder, you know, what decade are you in? What century are you in? The decimation that takes place. And
that's Norman Solomon in an excerpt from our in-depth interview. And what you're hearing is the comment from the author of War Made Easy. Norman Solomon's book explains how propaganda has been used to persuade us to go to war time after time, and how Democrats collude with Republicans, particularly in recent years, to sell us wars that are really bad ideas. And we're ready to do it again with the commitments of more troops to Afghanistan, the showdown with North Korea, the new Cold War with Russia, the conflict in Syria, our ongoing conflicts in Iraq and Yemen. And there's much more, but gosh, how much time do you have? Trump is fuming because William Orrick III, who comes from a distinguished legal family here in San Francisco and is now a federal judge, he was appointed by Obama. Orrick ruled and put a permanent nationwide hold on the executive order that Trump signed in January in an attempt to intimidate sanctuary cities and other jurisdictions by threatening to withhold federal funds. The White House called the ruling an egregious overreach by a single unelected judge. Hey, all federal judges are unelected. Didn't you know that? Huh? So Orrick issued a nationwide injunction blocking enforcement of Trump's executive order targeting cities and counties across the country that have pledged to be a safe haven to undocumented immigrants. The order, in line with one of Trump's signature campaign pledges, is aimed at forcing cities to cooperate by threatening to withhold government funding. San Francisco filed suit. That's why the venue was here. And what's interesting is that Trump, in his angry tweets, doesn't really appear to know the difference between this district court and the appeals court in this part of the country, the Ninth Circuit. They are separate. But Trump said, well, first the Ninth Circuit Court rules against the ban. You're not supposed to call it a ban, Don. And now it hits again on sanctuary cities. Both ridiculous rulings. See you in the Supreme Court. Another tweet. This San Francisco judge's erroneous ruling is a gift to the criminal gang and cartel element in our country, empowering the worst kind of human trafficking and sex trafficking and putting thousands of innocent lives at risk. One other tweet. Out of our very big country with many choices, does everyone notice that both the ban case and now the sanctuary case has brought in the Ninth Circuit, which has a terrible record of being overturned? They used to call this judge shopping. Well, it's interesting. This morning in my commute, I flipped on the right-wing radio station and listened to Rush Limbaugh. And I heard him lie. He said, Republicans never file lawsuits to block executive orders, and we don't venue shop. But when Obama signed his executive order on immigration after seeing obstruction from the Republicans for over 6 years, they hammered him, and they immediately took him to court, venue shopping in a circuit in southern Texas where they knew which judge they would get. And he predictably ruled against the executive orders of Obama. But Rush says that never happened. Now, let me peel back here from the politics. I'm glad to see this order stymieing Trump. But I have to acknowledge that the actual threat of withholding federal funds is uncertain and not as extreme as these lawsuits make out, in my humble opinion, because there's a recent Supreme Court precedent that says you can only withhold funds that are directly related to the lack of compliance by a local jurisdiction. Now, I heard a caller to Rush Limbaugh this morning saying, well, hey, what about the bathroom ban? Obama put that out and threatened to withhold education funds. Well, it was aimed at public schools. And so there, at least, for my non-legal mind, it has some validity. But, you can't expect the Republicans to actually be accurate in the details of these issues. So the other side of the border, in the Mexican Congress yesterday, the foreign minister, Luis Videgaray, not sure how to pronounce that name, Videgaray, he tore into the idea of building a border wall, calling it unfriendly, a hostile act, unlikely to fulfill the objectives, said that Mexico will not contribute a single peso. The wall is not part of any bilateral discussion, nor should it be. Under no scenario will we contribute economically to an action of this kind. And here in the United States, good old Ted Cruz from Texas, he's introduced the El Chapo Act, suggesting that when El Chapo is convicted and has to cough up all of his illicit drug monies, estimated at $14 billion, that money can be used to pay for the wall. But an editor of a magazine in Mexico City said, there's irony in this, because if you fund the wall with a law named after the man who can tunnel through anything, oh, boy. So today was supposed to be the day that the White House of number 45 announced the beautiful, beautiful, beautiful tax cuts that he has promised to corporate and the ultra-wealthy in this country. And we don't get the package, sorry. We also don't get any projections on how much it'll cost the Treasury. But he's pretty certain that he's going to lower the corporate tax rate from 34% to 15%. Nobody pays it anyway, so really won't matter that much. But to bring along the little people, the middle class, they are planning to increase the standard deduction. Now, this will benefit some people who can't use Schedule A to itemize mortgage interest. And it might simplify tax filing, and, as you know, I'm not opposed to that. But we'll have to see the details here. What is clear is that they are going to use the Laffer curve once again. I mentioned this yesterday. This goes back to the Reagan tax cuts where they pretended that you can cut taxes and actually more revenue will flow into the federal treasury. It didn't happen for Reagan. Bush claimed the same thing. That's George W. Bush, and it didn't work for him. And his daddy had referred to the Laffer curve and the Reagan tax cuts as voodoo economics back in the 1988 campaign, if some of you remember. On Capitol Hill, they confirmed, the Senate did yesterday, Rod Rosenstein to be Deputy Attorney General. He has been the U.S. Attorney for Maryland, and he is likely to spearhead any investigation of the Trump-Russia controversy because Jeffrey Beauregard, Jim Crow Sessions, the Attorney General, has been forced to recuse himself. We'll see just how effective all that is. Two tales of public speakers. Barack Obama, a former president of the United States, has agreed to accept 400,000 smackers to speak at a healthcare conference sponsored by the Wall Street investment bank Cantor Fitzgerald. Now, he's already scored a book deal for Michelle and himself worth tens of millions of dollars. And I hope that Obama will not just pocket all this money. Yeah, it's a free market, and he's free, and, he can speak to anybody he wants. But this is so tawdry. At least give some of the money to charity, will you? Maybe help people pay their Obamacare premiums. And the other speaker that's been in contention, Ann Coulter, has finally formally canceled her threat to speak at Berkeley tomorrow. And it's been a mess. It's put me in a position where I've had to defend her First Amendment rights, and begrudgingly I do so. But what really offends me is that Bill Maher and others have just broadly blamed liberals for preventing Ann Coulter from speaking. And it's a handful of anarchist types who have hit the streets of Berkeley and created the risk to public safety that the university cited in not agreeing to schedule her speech. Glad that one is over. And finally today, United Airlines has another big PR problem. This time, the critter, the furry little friendly fella, who was on track to become the world's largest rabbit, his name was Simon, died while he was en route from London to Chicago O'Hare in the belly of a United Airlines plane. Now, we don't know the details of how Simon died, but I predict an even bigger firestorm over this dead rabbit than when they hauled David Dow off the plane when they needed to clear his seat for a flight attendant or a flight crew member. We'll see, but the way things work in this world, there are a lot of people who get more outraged over maltreatment of animals than they do of humans. Hey, thanks for listening to today's News and Comment podcast. It's always free. You're free to share it far and wide, and you can find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.